I've always believed that houses don't just hold memories, they hold debts. Some debts are paid in interest, some in blood, and others simply wait in the corners of a room until the right person comes to collect. I was standing on the sidewalk of 42nd Street, looking at the Victorian house I grew up in. It was a grand, peeling thing, white paint flaking off like dead skin, revealing the gray, weathered wood beneath. My father had bought this house in 1954, when the neighbors moved out overnight, because they couldn't stand the thought of us breathing the same air. Now, 70 years later, the neighborhood had turned over again. The pioneers were back, wearing expensive linen and carrying organic lattes, looking at these homes as projects rather than legacies. A neon bright sign was hammered into the front lawn, estate sale. Everything must go. I smoothed the front of my wool coat. I am 78 years old. My movements are deliberate. My spine is a straight line, forged by decades of standing when others wanted me to kneel. I didn't come here for the furniture. I came because I received a phone call from a young man named Victor, the new owner. He told me he'd found a few boxes of old junk in the attic and wanted to know if I wanted to buy them back before they went to the dumpster. Buy them back, I whispered to the cold morning air. As I walked up the porch steps, the wood groaned. It remembered me, but the woman standing at the front door did not. She was in her late 20s, wearing a headset and holding a clipboard. She looked at me with that specific kind of polite condescension reserved for the elderly, as if my age had rendered me invisible or, worse, simple. "The sale doesn't start for another 10 minutes, ma'am," she said, her voice sugary and thin. "You'll have to wait in line with the others." I looked past her into the foyer. My mother's crystal chandelier was gone, replaced by an industrial-style bulb hanging from a black cord. The mahogany banister I used to slide down had been painted a flat, trendy charcoal. "I'm Coralie Anderson," I said quietly. "I spoke with Mr. Caldwell. I'm here for the items in the attic." The girl checked her clipboard, her eyes scanning quickly. She didn't find my name immediately, and I watched the irritation flicker across her face. "Mr. Caldwell is very busy prepping the main floor. If it's just attic junk, it's probably out back in the low-value bins. You can check there." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked through me. She saw a quiet black woman in a sensible coat and assumed I was looking for bargain bin linens. She didn't see the woman who had spent 30 years as a senior auditor for the state. She didn't see the woman who knew exactly how much the Caldwell family had paid for this house, and exactly whose signatures were forged on the deed transfer 40 years ago when my father was too sick to see the pen in his hand. "The attic," I repeated, my voice like silk over a blade. "I'll find my own way." I didn't wait for her permission. I stepped past her, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the smell of floor wax and old ghosts. As I reached the stairs, I heard her mutter something into her headset about unruly locals. I didn't turn back. I knew something she didn't. Victor Caldwell thought he was selling off the remnants of a forgotten family. He thought the attic was filled with nothing but silence and dust. But as I placed my hand on that charcoal-painted banister, I felt the house shudder. The attic wasn't silent because it was empty. It was silent because it was holding its breath. The stairs didn't creak under my weight. They sighed. It was the sound of wood that had been stripped of its carpet and its dignity. As I ascended to the second floor, the air grew thinner, tasting of drywall dust and expensive candles, the scent of people trying to mask the smell of history. I saw Victor Caldwell before he saw me. He was standing in what used to be my bedroom, gesturing wildly with a tape measure while a contractor nodded along. Victor was 35, with a haircut that cost more than my first month's rent and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. To him, this house was an asset class. To me, it was a ledger. "Cora, there you are," he called out, his voice booming with a false, practiced warmth. He didn't come to meet me. He waited for me to walk to him. Glad you could make it. We're moving fast today. High interest, you know? This zip code is exploding. Exploding, I repeated, my voice steady. A violent word for a neighborhood. Victor. He chuckled, a hollow sound. Just a figure of speech. Listen, I had my team pull those boxes from the attic. They're in the hallway. Mostly old papers, some moth-eaten clothes. I'll give them to you for a flat $200. Since you grew up here, I figure it's the neighborly thing to do. I looked at the 3 cardboard boxes sitting against the wall. They were stained with water and age, but the tape on the middle one was fresh. It hadn't been sealed by my father. It had been opened, searched, and resealed badly. $200 for my own birth certificate and my mother's Sunday hat. I asked, my gaze drifting to the fireplace mantel. The mantel was white marble, or it had been. Now it was covered in a faux concrete finish. I remembered my father hiding a small tin box behind the loose brick in that chimney back in 1984. He told me it was his insurance policy against men like Victor's father, who had been the city's lead developer at the time. Everything has a price, Cora, Victor said, checking his watch. Labor to move them, storage fees, you understand. If you don't want them, the junk haulers are coming at 5. I need the space for the wine cellar. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was squeezing a few extra dollars out of a sentimental old woman. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't looking at the boxes. I was looking at the smudge of soot on his cuff. He'd been poking around the fireplace. He'd found the tin box, but he hadn't been able to open it. The lock was a specialty, a puzzle box my grandfather, a locksmith, had forged. I'll pay the $200, I said, opening my purse. I pulled out the bills, crisp and exact. But I'd like a moment alone in the attic. One last look at the view of the oak tree. My father used to say you could see the whole world from that window. Victor took the money, his eyes lighting up at the easy win. Sure. 5 minutes. The stairs are a bit steep. Don't trip. He walked away, already back on his phone, dismissively waving a hand toward the narrow door at the end of the hall. He didn't notice that I hadn't moved toward the boxes. I waited until I heard his footsteps move toward the kitchen. Then I slipped into the attic. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air was thick with the silence of things left unsaid. In the corner, by the window, there was a small pile of debris Victor's team had ignored, shards of a broken mirror and an old, heavy iron. But it was the silence that was screaming. I knelt by the floorboards near the chimney stack. Victor had tried to pry them up. I could see the fresh scratches in the wood. He was looking for the gold his father had whispered about on his deathbed. He thought my father was a thief. He didn't realize my father was a record keeper. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal. The key Victor didn't know existed. I didn't need to pry the boards. I just needed to know which one to press. You're looking in the wrong place, Victor, I whispered to the empty room. You're looking for what was stolen. I'm looking for what was owed. I pressed the knot in the wood, and the board didn't pop up. It slid sideways. Inside wasn't gold. It was a stack of ledgers, bound in rotting leather, detailing every bribe, every payoff, and every illegal zoning favor Victor's father had paid for to build his empire. The first name on the first page wasn't a Caldwell. It was the name of the man who currently sat on the city's historical preservation board. The man Victor was currently lobbying for a tax break. The air in the attic was thick, stagnant, and tasted of ancient charcoal. I sat on a low trunk, the leather-bound ledger, heavy in my lap. Below me, I could hear the muffled sounds of the estate sale beginning, the chime of the front door, the upbeat chatter of the girl with the headset, and the heavy thud of furniture being dragged across the floors. They were dissecting my life, piece by piece, while I sat in the skull of the house, reading its darkest thoughts. I turned the first page. My father's handwriting was a masterclass in precision. He had been a man of few words, but his pen was exhaustive. He hadn't just recorded the money. He'd recorded the why. November 12th, 1982. Delivered envelope to Arthur Caldwell at the construction site on 5th. He didn't look at me. He looked at the crane. Said the city belongs to those who build, not those who inhabit. Paid $5,000 to the zoning commissioner's brother-in-law the next morning. I traced the ink. This wasn't just a record of corruption. It was a map of how my neighborhood had been hollowed out. Arthur Caldwell, Victor's father, hadn't just built skyscrapers. He had dismantled lives to clear the dirt for them. He'd used my father as a courier because a black man in a delivery uniform was invisible in 1982. No one looked at the man holding the envelope. They only looked at the man receiving it. A floorboard groaned behind me. I didn't jump. At my age, sudden movements are for the guilty or the frightened, and I was neither. Still up here, Cora? It was Victor. He was leaning against the doorframe, his expensive suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up to reveal a watch that cost more than a year of my father's salary. He was trying to look casual, but his eyes were darting toward the floorboards I had just closed. He was sweating, a thin, oily sheen on his forehead that the attic's chill shouldn't have allowed. The oak tree hasn't changed much, I said, slowly closing the ledger and tucking it under my arm, hidden by the folds of my heavy coat, though it looks smaller from up here than it did when I was 6. Victor took a step into the room, his eyes narrowing. What's that you've got there? I thought I told you the boxes were in the hallway. Just an old scrapbook. Victor. Scraps of paper. Memories of people who aren't around to defend themselves. I stood up, my knees popping with a sound like dry twigs. You look troubled. Is the sale not going as planned? He wiped his brow, his neighborly mask slipping for a fraction of a second. The historical board is being a pain. Some local activists are trying to flag the house for a preservation status. If they succeed, I can't gut the interior for the modern open plan. It'll tank my ROI. I nodded sympathetically. Roy, return on investment. My father used to talk about returns, too. He just called them consequences. Victor let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Look, Cora, I don't have time for philosophy. I've got a VIP buyer downstairs who wants the fireplace mantle, the one you were staring at earlier. My contractor says there's a hollow space behind the brickwork. You wouldn't happen to know what's in there, would you? He was fishing. He was desperate. He knew his father had hidden something, and he assumed it was liquid assets, cash, or jewelry. He couldn't conceive of a man keeping a record of his own shame. The house has many hollow spaces, Victor, I said, walking toward him. I didn't stop until I was inches away. I could smell the espresso on his breath and the underlying scent of a man who was losing his grip. But sometimes the things we hide are more valuable when they stay hidden. Don't you agree? He stepped back, unnerved by the lack of blink in my eyes. Right. Whatever. Just take your boxes and go. I have a business to run. I walked past him, the ledger tucked tight against my ribs. As I reached the attic door, I stopped and looked back. One more thing, Victor. That VIP buyer for the mantle? I'd check his credentials. This neighborhood has a way of attracting people who are looking for things they didn't lose. I left him standing in the dust, his shadow long and thin against the flaking walls. He thought he was the hunter, but he was merely the bait. You see, Victor made a fatal mistake. He thought I came back to save my memories. He never considered that I came back to weaponize them. I carried those 3 water-stained boxes to my car with the measured pace of a woman carrying a sleeping child. To the girl with the headset, watching from the porch, I was just a relic reclaiming trash. She didn't see the way my fingers curled around the edge of the middle box, the one Victor had already picked through. He had missed the most important thing because he was looking for gold. Men like Victor always look for the shine. They don't realize that in the world of power, the real currency is ink on paper. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, the engine idling quietly. I didn't drive away. I watched the front door of my childhood home through the rearview mirror. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, and a man stepped out. He was older than Victor, dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered of old money and quiet rooms. That was Arthur Caldwell's former protege, Marcus Thorne. He was the man currently sitting on the Historical Preservation Board, the very man Victor was trying to charm for his tax breaks. I opened the ledger in my lap to page 42. June 1989, M. Thorne. Payment for expediting the demolition of the 42nd Street Community Center. $12,000. Cash delivered in a bakery box. I looked from the ledger to the man walking up my porch steps. Marcus Thorne wasn't there to help Victor with a tax break. He was there because he knew Victor was selling the house, and he was terrified of what might be left inside. He was there to sanitize his own past. I felt a cold, sharp spark of satisfaction. It was the first time in 40 years I had felt truly warm. My father had been a quiet man. He spent his life being useful to men who thought they were his masters. He recorded every bribe not out of malice, but out of a survival instinct. He knew that for a black man in this city, the truth wasn't a shield, it was a hostage. He had held that hostage until the day he died, and then he had handed the rope to me. Patience, Cora, I whispered to myself. The fruit is ripening. Don't pick it while it's still bitter. I pulled away from the curb just as Victor greeted Marcus Thorne with a frantic, eager handshake. Victor looked like a puppy trying to please a wolf. He didn't realize that Marcus Thorne would burn this house to the ground with Victor inside it if it meant that ledger never saw the light of day. I drove to a small, quiet cafe 3 blocks away, a place that used to be a pharmacy where they wouldn't serve my mother at the counter. Now, it was a place where people typed on laptops and ignored one another. I took a table in the back, ordered a peppermint tea, and began to cross-reference the ledger with the papers in the junk boxes Victor had sold me for $200. Among the old recipes and yellowed utility bills, I found what I was looking for. It was a folded piece of stationery from the Caldwell Development Group, dated 3 days before my father's accidental fall down the cellar stairs in 1994. It wasn't a letter. It was a list of demands. Victor thought he was clever for charging me to take my own history back. He didn't realize he had just handed me the physical proof of the motive behind my father's death. He had sold me the missing piece of a murder for the price of a nice dinner. I sipped my tea. It was hot, herbal, and perfectly clear. The social hierarchy of this neighborhood was about to shift, not through a protest and not through a lawsuit. It was going to shift because I knew exactly which thread to pull to make the whole tapestry unravel. I sat in the back of the cafe, the peppermint tea cooling until it was as cold as the realization in my chest. My father hadn't just been a record keeper. He had been a witness. And witnesses are only safe as long as they are useful or silent. I turned the pages of the ledger with the tips of my fingers, careful not to smudge the history. The names read like a who's who of the city's elite. It wasn't just Marcus Thorne. There were judges, city council members, and heads of construction firms. They had all sat at Arthur Caldwell's table, and my father had been the one to clear the plates and carry the envelopes. March 14th, 1994. Caldwell asked for the blue folder. He looked tired, told me I'd been loyal too long, suggested I retire to the country. I told him this house is my country. He didn't like that answer. That was 2 months before the fall. I looked up from the book. Through the cafe window, I could see the gentrified street, the yoga studios, and the boutique pet shops. The people walking by had no idea that the very foundations of their charming neighborhood were poured over the bones of men like my father. Victor Caldwell thought he was a businessman. He was just a scavenger living in the carcass of his father's sins. But scavengers are dangerous when they're hungry, and Victor was starving for a win. I pulled my cell phone from my purse. I don't use social media, and I don't care for viral moments. I prefer a more direct line of communication. I dialed a number I had kept in my Rolodex for 30 years, a man named Silas. He had been a cub reporter when my father died, the only one who had bothered to ask why a man as careful as Conrad Anderson would trip over a perfectly clear basement step. "Silas," I said when he picked up. His voice was gravelly now, aged by decades of chasing shadows. "Cora, it's been a long time. I heard the Caldwell kid was selling your place." "He is," I said, watching a young woman across the cafe take a picture of her avocado toast. "He's also selling things he doesn't understand. I have the blue folder, Silas, and the black book." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Silas's breathing hitch. He knew exactly what those words meant. In our world, the Black Book was a myth, the definitive proof of how the 42nd Street development had been stolen. "Where are you?" he whispered. "I'm at the old pharmacy. But I'm not staying. I'm going to the library, the one with the vaulted ceilings and the quiet corners." "Cora, be careful. If Victor or Marcus Thorne even suspects, they don't suspect a woman of my age of anything other than forgetting her keys. Silas. That is their greatest weakness. They think I'm part of the furniture." I hung up. I didn't need to explain further. Silas would meet me, and he would bring the one thing I needed, a platform that couldn't be silenced by a Caldwell payoff. As I stood to leave, I saw the girl with the headset from the estate sale walk into the cafe. She looked frazzled, her eyes darting around until they landed on me. She marched over, her heels clicking aggressively on the tile. "Miss Anderson? Mr. Caldwell sent me. He says there was a mistake. In the boxes he sold you. He needs them back immediately. He's willing to refund your $200. Double it, even." I looked at her, my face a mask of polite confusion. I let the silence stretch until she shifted uncomfortably. "A mistake?" I asked softly. The only mistake I saw were the moth holes in my mother's Sunday hat. "Does Victor want the moths back, dear?" "He was very insistent," she said, her voice dropping the sugary tone. "He said if you don't return them, he'll have to involve the authorities. He's claiming theft of sensitive business documents." I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just seen her opponent play exactly the card she expected. "Theft? I have a receipt, typed on Caldwell Development letterhead. Everything in those boxes belongs to me." I leaned in closer, and for the first time, she looked intimidated. "Tell Victor that if he wants to talk about sensitive documents, he should come find me himself. But he should be careful. Some things once opened can never be closed again." I walked past her, leaving her standing in the middle of the cafe. She was just a messenger, and I don't waste my energy on the help. The game was no longer about the house. It was about the debt. And Victor was about to find out that I don't take cash. The city library is a cathedral of hushed voices and cold marble. It is the only place where a woman of my vintage can sit for hours without being questioned, as long as she has a book in her hand and a look of scholarly intent. I chose a table in the periodicals section, tucked deep in the stacks where the light was dim, and the security cameras were relics of a decade past. Silas arrived 20 minutes later. He didn't look like a man who had spent 40 years chasing the truth. He looked like a man who had been caught by it. His coat was rumpled, and his eyes were rimmed with the red fatigue of a lifetime of deadlines. He sat across from me, his hands trembling slightly as he set a leather satchel on the table. "Cora," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, "you're playing with fire. The Caldwell Group isn't just a developer anymore. They own half the PACs in this state. If they know you have that ledger—" "They know," I said, sliding the black book across the table. I didn't let go of it. I kept my hand on the cover, a tether to the man who had died to keep these secrets. Victor sent his assistant to harass me at the cafe. "He's panicked, Silas." A man in a panic makes mistakes. A man like Victor, who has never known a day of real consequence, thinks he can buy his way out of a landslide. Silas opened the ledger. I watched his eyes track the lines, the dates, the dollar amounts, the names that still appeared on the nightly news. He stopped at page 82. The 1994 transit project. Silas breathed. "My God, Cora, this isn't just bribery. This is a map of how they destroyed the black business district. They didn't just build the highway. They routed it specifically to devalue the land Caldwell wanted to buy for pennies. And my father was the one who delivered the incentives to the city planners," I added. "He thought he was being a good soldier. He thought he was building a future for us. By the time he realized he was just helping them dig a mass grave for our community, it was too late." I pulled a folded, yellowed blueprint from the junk box Victor had sold me. It was the original plan for the 42nd Street renovation. In the margins in my father's cramped, elegant script were the words, "Caldwell says the basement needs to be deeper. More storage." He asked for the locksmith's contact. Silas looked from the blueprint to me. "Your grandfather was the locksmith." "He was," I said, "and he built a vault in that house that Victor still hasn't found. Victor thinks the gold is behind the mantel. He's been tearing at the marble like a common thief. But the real treasure, the physical evidence of the 1994 payoffs, the signed contracts Arthur Caldwell thought he'd burned, isn't in the walls. It's under the garden, under the oak tree Victor wants to cut down for his modern landscaping." Silas leaned back, the weight of the story pressing him into his chair. "If we publish this, Cora, the lawsuits will bankrupt him. The criminal charges will bury Marcus Thorne and every name in this book, but they'll come for you first." I looked at my hands. They were spotted with age, but they were steady. "I have lived 78 years, Silas. I have buried a husband, a father, and a neighborhood. There is nothing they can take from me that I haven't already made peace with losing." I pushed the ledger all the way across the table. "I don't want a headline, Silas. I want a funeral. I want to watch Victor Caldwell stand on that porch and realize that every brick he owns is made of glass." Just then, my phone vibrated on the table. It was an unknown number. I answered it without hesitation. "Miss Anderson." The voice was smooth, cold, and unmistakably Marcus Thorne. "I believe you have something that belongs to the city's history. Victor is a boy. He doesn't understand the gravity of certain records. I do. Let's meet this evening. At the house. Before the auction concludes. I think we can reach an equitable arrangement." I looked at Silas and allowed myself a tiny, sharp smile. "I'll be there, Mr. Thorne," I said. "I've always felt the house was unfinished. It's time we finally settled the accounts." The library began to empty as the sun dipped below the city's skyline, casting long skeletal shadows across the marble floor. Silas looked at me with a mixture of awe and genuine terror. He knew that by agreeing to meet Marcus Thorne at the house, I wasn't just walking into a lion's den. I was walking into the mouth of a hungry machine. "Cora, don't go alone," he whispered, his hand hovering over the ledger as if it were a live wire. "Thorne isn't Victor. He doesn't play with headsets and clipboards. He's the kind of man who makes people disappear into the footnotes of history." I'm never alone in that house, Silas, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. I have 70 years of ghosts standing behind me. Besides, a man like Thorne doesn't kill an old woman in a Victorian parlor. It's too messy for his brand. He'll try to buy me first. He'll try to appeal to my good sense or my legacy. He'll offer me a check that would make my ancestors weep. I stood up, adjusting my coat. Take the ledger. Photocopy every page. Send a digital copy to your editor and another to an offshore server. If I'm not out of that house by 9 o'clock, you release it all. Don't wait for a phone call. Don't wait for a sign. Just burn the world down. Silas nodded, his face pale. I left him there, a small man drowned by a giant story, and walked out into the biting evening air. I drove back to 42nd Street. The estate sale signs had been taken down, but the house was lit from within, glowing like a paper lantern. 2 cars were parked out front, Victor's flashy European sports car, and a black sedan that looked like it belonged to the government. I didn't enter through the front door. I used the side gate, the one that led to the garden. The oak tree stood there, a massive, gnarled sentinel that had seen every secret my family had ever kept. I looked at the patch of earth, near the roots, the spot where the soil was just a little darker, a little richer. The gold wasn't buried in a chest. It was buried in a lead-lined box, protected from the rot of time. Inside were the original property deeds, the ones Arthur Caldwell had forced my father to lose so the development could proceed. Those deeds proved that the Caldwell Group didn't own the land the new luxury condos were sitting on. I did. I walked up the back porch steps and entered the kitchen. The smell of expensive cigars hit me immediately, a scent that belonged to my childhood, to the nights my father would come home smelling of other men's vices. Victor and Marcus Thorne were in the dining room. They had a bottle of scotch open on the table, my father's mahogany table, which they hadn't yet managed to sell. Cora, Thorne said, standing up. He didn't offer a hand. He knew better. Thank you for coming. Victor here was just telling me about your sentimental attachment to some old paperwork. Victor looked like he wanted to scream. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot. He had spent the afternoon realizing that he had sold the very rope he was about to be hanged with. It's more than sentiment, Mr. Thorne, I said, pulling out a chair and sitting down without being asked. I placed my purse on the table. It's accounting. My father kept very good records. He knew that in this city, a black man's word is worth nothing, but a white man's signature is worth everything. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes like flint. Let's skip the poetry. Cora, you have the ledger. You probably have the deeds Victor was too stupid to find. Tell me your price. We can set up a trust. Your grandchildren will never have to work a day in their lives. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fear beneath the silk tie. He wasn't worried about the money. He was worried about the shame. He was worried about the statues they'd have to take down and the buildings they'd have to rename. You think this is about money? I said softly. That's your first mistake. My second mistake was ever believing you were worth my father's life. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. I pressed play. He's also selling things he doesn't understand. I have the blue folder, Silas, and the black book. Then Thorne's voice, recorded just an hour ago. Victor is a boy. He doesn't understand the gravity of certain records. I do. I think we can reach an equitable arrangement. Thorne's face went gray. In the eyes of the law, that was the beginning of a conspiracy to suppress evidence. You're recording us? Victor spat, half rising from his chair. Sit down, Victor, I said, and for the first time, I let the steel in my voice show. You're out of your depth. You're playing checkers in a house where the walls are built of chess pieces. I looked back at Thorne. I don't want your trust fund. I want the deed to this house returned to the Anderson estate, and I want a public confession of the zoning errors made in 1994. Thorne laughed, a dry, bitter sound. That would ruin us. We'd lose everything. Exactly, I said. The house was silent, but for the first time in 40 years, the silence didn't feel like a wait. It felt like a countdown. The silence that followed my demand wasn't empty. It was pressurized. Victor looked like he was vibrating, his hands gripping the edge of my father's mahogany table, so hard his knuckles were the color of bone. Marcus Thorne, however, had gone perfectly still. That was the mark of a man who had spent his life calculating the cost of collateral damage. You're asking for the impossible, Cora, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. A public confession? The Anderson estate, reclaiming this property? Do you have any idea how many titles, how many bank loans, and how many city contracts are tied to the legality of this deed? You'd be pulling the thread that unravels a billion-dollar tapestry. Then I suggest you start sharpening your scissors, Marcus. I replied. I didn't lean back. I leaned in, because the tapestry is already rotting. My father didn't just record the bribes. He recorded the meetings where you and Arthur discussed the structural integrity of the black-owned buildings on Fifth Street, the ones that miraculously caught fire or were condemned by inspectors on your payroll. Victor let out a sharp, panicked breath. That was 40 years ago. The statutes of limitations don't apply to racketeering and ongoing conspiracy, Victor. I interrupted, not even looking at him. And they certainly don't apply to the court of public opinion. Silas has the ledger. By 9 p.m., he'll have the digital scans. If I don't walk out of here and call him, the story doesn't just go to the local rag. It goes to the federal investigators who have been sniffing around the Caldwell Group's Opportunity Zone tax credits for 3 years. I saw the flicker in Thorne's eyes. I had hit the nerve. He didn't care about the past. He cared about the current investigation. I was the bridge between his father's sins and his own impending indictment. You're bluffing, Victor snapped, though his voice cracked. You're just a bitter old woman who wants her childhood bedroom back. You don't have the stomach for a war. I finally turned my gaze to him. I let him see the 78 years of stomach I had. I let him see the woman who had watched her father's funeral with dry eyes because she knew she had to stay sharp to survive. I've lived through Jim Crow, the riots of '68, and the slow, quiet poisoning of this neighborhood by men like your father. I said, I have a very high tolerance for war, Victor. What I don't have is time. And neither do you. Thorne reached for the scotch, his movements stiff. He poured a glass, but he didn't drink. He just stared at the amber liquid. If we give you the house, if we settle the Anderson claim quietly, what happens to the ledger? The original stays with me, I said. The digital copies stay in a dead man's switch account, as long as the Anderson estate is left in peace. And as long as the 42nd Street Community Fund receives a very large, anonymous donation from the Caldwell Foundation, the book stays closed. But the confession, that's non-negotiable. You'll blame clerical errors and previous management. You'll make it look like a noble correction of a historical wrong. You love those, don't you? Branding yourself as the man who fixes the past. Thorne looked at me, and for a second, there was a glimmer of genuine respect in his eyes. It was the respect of one predator recognizing another. You've been planning this since the day your father died, he whispered. No, I corrected him, standing up and smoothing my coat. I've been planning this since the day he was born. He was a good man who was used by bad men. I'm just the auditor coming to collect the interest. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking on the floor Victor had tried to strip of its history. I'll expect the preliminary paperwork by tomorrow morning, I said over my shoulder. And Victor, don't bother with the wine cellar. You won't be here long enough to drink it. As I stepped out onto the porch, The night air felt different. It didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like a clean slate. But as I reached my car, I saw a shadow move near the oak tree. A third player had entered the yard, someone Victor hadn't mentioned. I didn't reach for my keys. I didn't quicken my pace. To show fear to a shadow is to give it substance, and I have spent too many years walking through the dark to be startled by a silhouette. I simply stood by the driver's side door, my hand resting on the cold metal, and waited for the night to speak first. The figure stepped out from behind the great oak. It wasn't a hired thug or a process server. It was a woman. She was younger than me, perhaps in her early 60s, dressed in a sharp, navy blue trench coat that looked like armor. Her hair was a shock of silver, pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a permanent expression of skepticism. "I wondered if you'd actually do it, Cora," she said. Her voice was like gravel shifting under a heavy boot. "Evelyn," I said, my breath hitching only for a second. "I thought you moved to the coast after they condemned your father's pharmacy." Evelyn Reed. Her father had been the pharmacist who wouldn't serve my mother at the counter, the same man whose business had been swallowed whole by Arthur Caldwell's 1994 beautification project. We hadn't spoken in 30 years, not since the day the bulldozers arrived and our father's world turned to dust. "I moved," she said, stepping into the dim glow of the street lamp. "But I never stopped watching. I saw the estate sale listing. I knew you'd come back for the ledger. My father always said Conrad Anderson was the only man in this city who knew where the receipts were buried." I looked at her, searching for the girl I used to avoid on the playground. "Your father and mine weren't friends, Evelyn. They were victims of the same man, but they sat on opposite sides of a very thick wall." "The wall is gone now, Cora," she said, walking closer until she was standing just a few feet away. "Caldwell tore it down so he could build a parking lot. My father died broke, screaming about blueprints and forgeries. I'm not here for an apology. I'm here for my share of the truth." I realized then that Silas wasn't the only one who had been keeping a flame for this day. The neighborhood wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a network of Gree Andersons. "Victor and Thorne are inside," I said, nodding toward the house. "They're currently weighing the cost of their souls. Thorne thinks he can buy my silence with a deed and a donation." Evelyn's eyes flashed, a predatory glint that matched my own. "He's a fool. He thinks this is about one house. He doesn't realize there are 20 other families with names in that book. Families who lost everything while he was sipping scotch in a penthouse." She reached into her coat and pulled out a manila envelope. "You have the ledger, Cora, but I have the bank records from the pharmacy's foreclosure. It shows the wire transfers from Caldwell's shell companies directly to the judge who signed the order. We don't just have a story. We have a syndicate." The air between us shifted. For decades, the history of 42nd Street had been a fragmented thing. My secrets, her records, Silas's headlines. But standing here, under the tree that had watched it all, the pieces were finally clicking into place. "They'll kill the story if it's just one woman's revenge," Evelyn whispered. "But they can't kill a class action ghost story." I looked back at the house. Victor was visible through the dining room window, pacing like a caged animal. He thought he was negotiating with a ghost. He didn't realize the graveyard was standing up. "Go to Silas," I said, handing her a small slip of paper with the library's address. "Tell him the pharmacy files have arrived. If Thorne wants to play at being a noble corrector of history, we're going to give him a very long list of things to correct." As Evelyn disappeared into the shadows of the neighboring driveway, I felt a tremor in the ground. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the sound of the foundation finally giving way. I got into my car and started the engine. I had told Thorne I'd expect the paperwork by morning. What I hadn't told him was that by the time he signed it, the house wouldn't be his to give. I drove away from the curb, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror until the glowing Victorian house was nothing but a speck of amber in the dark. My hands were light on the steering wheel. For the first time in 40 years, the phantom weight of my father's silence wasn't sitting in the passenger seat. I didn't go home. I went to a small, 24-hour diner on the edge of the district, a place where the coffee is burnt and the booths are deep enough to hide a conversation. Silas was already there, tucked into the far corner. Next to him sat Evelyn Reed, the predator and the chronicler, brought together by a ledger and a legacy of theft. "You're late," Silas said, pushing a cold cup of coffee toward me. I had to ensure Marcus Thorne felt the full weight of his options. I replied, sitting down. "He's currently convinced he's negotiating a private settlement. He thinks he's cauterizing a wound. He doesn't realize he's already systemic." Evelyn leaned forward, spreading the bank records across the laminated table. I showed Silas the wire transfers. "If we link these to the ledger entries for the 1994 zoning board, we don't just have corruption. We have a RICO case. Arthur Caldwell didn't just build a company. He built a criminal enterprise disguised as a construction firm." Silas looked at me, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "Cora, if we drop this tonight, Thorne will be arrested before the auction ends tomorrow. But if he's arrested, the assets will be frozen. You might never get the deed to the house. It'll be tied up in litigation for a decade." I looked at the steam rising from my cup. The house was never the prize, Silas. The house was the bait. I want the truth to be the only thing left standing when the dust clears. I pulled a small, silver flash drive from my pocket. "This contains the audio from tonight." Thorne admitting he understood the gravity of the records. It proves he knew the Caldwell Group's foundation was built on fraud. It turns a clerical error into a confession. "What's the move?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was steady, but I could see the tremor in her fingers. She had waited a lifetime to hit back at the men who broke her father. "We wait for the 8 a.m. auction." I said. Victor invited the city's tastemakers and investors to watch him sell off the last of the Anderson estate. He wants a spectacle. We're going to give him one. But we aren't going to be the ones shouting from the sidewalk. I looked at Silas. "You have the contact for the state attorney's office?" He nodded. "I've already sent the encrypted files. They've been looking for a reason to crack the Caldwell vault for years. This is the crowbar." "Good," I said. "Evelyn, you have the list of the families? The ones Thorne thinks he can ignore." "I've called every one of them," she said. "They're coming. Not with signs. Just present. They're going to stand on that lawn and watch the sun come up on a new reality." I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. Victor and Thorne thought they were dealing with an old woman who wanted her memories back. They didn't realize that when you strip a person of everything but their dignity, that dignity becomes a weapon. "One last thing," I said, looking at Silas. "Make sure the headline mentions my father's name. Not as a courier, not as a witness, as the man who kept the lights on when they tried to kill the sun." I left them there to finalize the details. I drove to a park overlooking the city and sat in the dark, watching the lights of the skyscrapers, buildings built with the money my father had carried in those blue envelopes. The city looked beautiful from a distance. It looked clean, but I knew the geometry of the shadows. I knew that every straight line was a lie, and every curve was a cover-up. The morning of the auction arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. I didn't dress like a victim, and I didn't dress like a revolutionary. I wore my best silk blouse, my pearls, and the wool coat that had seen me through 40 winters. I looked like a woman who was going to church, which was appropriate, because I was going to witness a reckoning. When I pulled up to 42nd Street at 7:45 a.m., The transformation was already underway. Victor had gone all out. There was a white marquee tent on the lawn, a catering spread of miniature quiches and sparkling water, and a podium with the Caldwell Development logo embossed in gold. A crowd of investors, men in tailored vests and women with expensive sunglasses pushed back into their hair, milled about, eyeing my childhood home like a prize steak. Victor was center stage, looking manic. His eyes were bloodshot, and he kept adjusting his tie, his gaze darting toward the front door as if he expected a ghost to walk out. Marcus Thorne stood off to the side, his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of pale fury. He saw me pull up, and for a moment, our eyes locked. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I simply stepped out of my car and leaned against the frame. Then, the others began to arrive. They didn't come in flashy cars. They came in dented sedans, on city buses, and on foot. They were the children of the pharmacy owner, the grandchildren of the dry cleaners, and the widows of the men who had been relocated for the highway project. There were 30 of them, then 50. They didn't carry signs. They didn't shout. They simply walked onto the sidewalk and stood in a silent, unbroken line facing the house. The investors began to whisper. The vibe, as Victor would call it, was curdling. "Miss Anderson," Victor called out, stepping off the podium and weaving through the wealthy crowd to reach me. His voice was a forced trill of anxiety. "What is this? Who are these people? I told you we'd have the paperwork by noon. You need to tell your friends to move. This is a private event. The sidewalk is public, Victor," I said, my voice carrying in the crisp morning air. "And the history of this land is communal. They aren't here to protest. They're here to watch the closing of the books." Thorne walked over, his phone tucked away. His professional composure was fracturing. "Cora, we had a deal. I've already contacted the foundation. The donation is being processed." "A donation is a gift, Marcus," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Restitution is a requirement, and you can't pay for silence when the room is already full of people who know the truth." Just then, a black sedan with government plates pulled up behind my car. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't from the city's building department. They had the look of federal investigators, the kind who don't care about local favors. Silas emerged from the crowd of onlookers, a camera around his neck and a tablet in his hand. He looked at me and gave a single, sharp nod. The story had broken. The digital ledger was live on the front page of the city's largest digital daily. The headline didn't just mention my father. It screamed his name. Conrad Anderson's Black Book, The Secret History of the Caldwell Empire. The investors in the tent were looking at their phones. The murmurs turned into a chilling silence. One woman dropped her glass of sparkling water. It shattered on the brick path my father had laid by hand. Victor looked at his phone, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure melting in the sun. You sent it? You actually did it." "I didn't do anything but stop holding my breath, Victor," I said. The federal agents approached Marcus Thorne. They didn't make a scene. They didn't use handcuffs. Not yet. They simply stood on either side of him. "Mr. Thorne, we have a warrant for the Caldwell Development Group's internal servers and your personal financial records. We'd like you to come with us." Thorne didn't look at the agents. He looked at me. For the first time, he saw not an old woman, but the architect of his ruin. He saw the years of calculation, the patience of a woman who knew that if you wait long enough by the river, the bodies of your enemies will float by. "You've destroyed the value of the entire block," Thorne hissed, his voice trembling. "Nobody will buy this house now. It's a crime scene." "No, Marcus," I said, as the silent crowd of neighbors began to step onto the lawn, reclaiming the grass. "It's finally a home again." The auctioneer stood at the podium, his gavel frozen in midair. There were no bids. There was only the sound of the wind through the oak tree and the quiet, steady footsteps of the people Victor had tried to erase. The auction tent sat like a white carcass on the lawn. The caterers were packing away the untouched quiches. Their movements hurried, as if they were afraid the very air of 42nd Street was now contagious. The investors had vanished into their luxury SUVs the moment the federal agents appeared, fleeing the scent of a scandal that could stain their own portfolios. Victor Caldwell was sitting on the bottom step of the porch, his head in his hands. His empire hadn't collapsed with a roar. It had evaporated with the ping of a news notification. Marcus Thorne was gone, driven away in the back of a black sedan to answer for 40 years of calculated cruelty. I walked up the path, my shadow long and steady in the morning light. The line of neighbors had broken, but they hadn't left. They were standing in small groups on the sidewalk, talking in low, reverent tones. Evelyn Reed was among them, holding a folder of her father's pharmacy records like a hymnal. I stopped in front of Victor. He didn't look up until my shadow fell over him. "You've ruined me," he whispered, his voice hollow. "The bank will foreclose by the end of the week. The city is freezing the development permits. This house, it's worthless now. Nobody will touch a Caldwell property." "It was never yours to sell, Victor," I said, my voice as calm as the dawn. "It was a debt you inherited, and you were too arrogant to realize you couldn't afford the interest." I reached into my purse and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the original deed I had recovered from the garden. I held it out to him. It wasn't a gift, it was a mirror. "My father died for this piece of paper," I said. "He was a man who believed in the foundation of things. You believed in the facade. Now, the facade is gone, and you're left with the dirt." Victor looked at the deed, then at the crowd of people on the sidewalk. He looked like a child who had finally realized the world didn't revolve around his inheritance. He stood up, his expensive suit wrinkled, and walked toward his car without saying another word. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't look at me. He just left, a ghost in a high-performance engine. I turned to face the house. The white paint was still flaking. The charcoal-painted banister was still a mistake. But the screaming silence in the attic had finally ceased. The house was breathing again. Silas walked up to the porch, his camera hanging heavy around his neck. The state attorney called. "Cora, they're opening a full grand jury investigation. They want the original ledger by tomorrow." "They can have it," I said. "The truth has done its work here. I'm just an old woman who wants to sit on her porch." "And the house?" Silas asked, looking at the peeling Victorian structure. "Thorne's lawyers are going to fight the deed transfer for months." "Let them fight," I said, a small, dangerous smile touching my lips. "I've spent 40 years waiting for this morning. I can wait a few more months for a signature. Besides, the neighborhood is already back." I looked out at the lawn. Evelyn was walking toward the oak tree, touching the bark with a hand that finally looked at peace. The children of the families who had been pushed out were standing on the sidewalk, looking at the homes their grandparents had built, seeing them not as projects, but as possibilities. The revenge wasn't in the arrests or the bankruptcies. It was in the restoration. It was in the fact that a quiet woman in a wool coat had outlasted the men who thought they could own the sun. I sat down on the top step, the wood groaning in a way that felt like a greeting. I closed my eyes and felt the warmth of the sun on my face. My father's debt was paid. The ledger was closed. And for the first time in my 78 years, I didn't have to watch my back. Because when you move with the weight of justice, the shadows have nowhere to hide. The thing about legacies built on secrets, the foundations always rot from the inside out. Look at the person sitting across from you. Look at the people who claim to revitalize your neighborhood. Ask yourself, whose name is written in the margins of their ledgers? And more importantly, who is holding the pen? The Caldwell family is gone, but there are thousands of houses just like this one, filled with silence that is actually a scream. If you believe the truth doesn't just come out, it hunts. then you belong here with us. Do you want to see what happened when a retired housekeeper found her employer's private basement and why the police haven't been able to enter that house since? Subscribe, share, and like and comment what city you are watching from to get notification for the next video. Don't let the door close behind you.